Should we just jump into the God stuff, or do you want to give more overview of the arc of the thing or something?
I'd say we just jump in because there's too much to just give an overview.
Yeah, so that was, I guess, the focus for this, even though the bulk of the book, and when he actually gets to talking about ethics, he belabors the point in much the same way Aristotle does in his later parts of the ethics that we avoided reading or just skimmed. His Nicomachean Ethics in our past episode, really getting into how all these emotions are built out of other emotions and just this very mechanical system. But since we're not going to talk about that part, the focus on this, I thought really everything flowed from this view that he has of God, which is just from the definition itself. We should start with substance to make the point, because this is the point that Wes alluded to, that God ends up being the only substance, right? Substances are not things in nature. Let me read the definition from the first page here. Definition 3. By substance, I understand that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. In other words, that the conception of which does not need the conception of another thing from which it must be formed.
Right.
And this is supposedly the definition of substance more or less taken from Descartes and from Aristotle. And in fact, I looked up Descartes on substance from the Blackwell Dictionary of Western Philosophy. Descartes' criterion for substance is virtually the same as Aristotle's subject criterion. He defines substance as that whose existence does not depend on other things, and claimed that there is, strictly speaking, only one substance, namely God, which is going to be Spinoza's point. However, although God is the only uncreated substance, created substances may be recognized because, although they need the concurrence of God in order to exist, they're independent of any other created things such as accidents or modes. Instead, created substances are the bearers of properties, modes, and accidents. A created substance for Descartes can be a thinking thing, or mind, or it can be an extended thing, or body. So there's what he's working off of.
So one way to think of substance is just what remains or is stable when you strip away all the properties of something, right? What is it that is their substrate? And then another way of thinking about it is the endpoint of explanation, which is sort of where Spinoza's definition 3 comes in, meaning that you have this causal chain where you conceive of one thing through another thing, and you go on and on and on until you get to sort of the bedrock, which no longer is understood through some lower level cause. And here, it's kind of ambiguous because cause, right, can mean what you understand something through, and then cause can mean actual, one thing physically causing another in the world. And Spinoza kind of puts those two things together.
Right. He says that's how we understand things.
Yeah.
Right. The way I understand your actions is by understanding that, you're the one doing them and understand something about you and what would bring about those actions. If I'm going to give an explanation of action, or if I see a phenomena in the world, if I see, footprints on the ground, the way I understand that is to understand who made the footprints. So he thinks that that's how explanation works. Conception.
Yeah, and this is straight out of Aristotle. To understand something is to understand its cause, to understand the why.
So
which corresponds to, in the sciences, creating general laws about things and saying that everything, for instance, operates according to gravity. Instead of just looking at one instance, you're connecting all the instances under a causal principle.
Yep. And so he takes this definition from Descartes and he just wants to make it consistent. He says, forget this distinction between uncreated substance, God, and created substances. Really, all these created substances, and I guess this is where I see the definition of God as infinite, right? Everybody agrees if there is a God, it's infinite. That's the definition, right?
Yeah.
At least part of the definition. And that means that there can't be anything that is separate from God. It's not infinite like, this line is infinite because I can divide it up infinitely many times. No, it is omnipresent. It is all-encompassing. It is infinite in that sense. And so there can't be any separate substances from God.
The contrasting, and you wonder how could there be any other view, and another bit I will steal from Karen Armstrong, is that in the 3rd century AD, theologians came up with this idea that God, in fact, created the universe out of nothingness. There was God there and there was the void, and he reached into the void and made the world out of the nothingness. So that ultimately what the nature of the world is nothingness that's touched by God. So anyway, you need some alternative if you don't want to have some view like Spinoza's, if you want to have a completely transcendent God that is separate from you and separate from the material world.
We want to talk about individual bodies and minds, but we shouldn't call them substances, because to understand what a body or mind is, we have to look at, what has caused that, what has caused this body to be here, what has caused. So he talks about this in a couple different ways, that we have to, if we're giving explanations of individual things, right? This man, why is this man here? Well, he had parents, so there's physical causes. You give an account of that. And there's also just the essence of things. How do we understand humanity or triangleness or something? And all those things, he says in some other way, rely on this underlying notion of God.
Right.
So you can't explain anything, he thinks, without referring to an infinite substrate that is underlying them. And then his argument for this is a little weird, which is just that, imagine that there's a limited thing. Well, how is it limited? Well, something must be containing it. So think of space itself. Is space infinite or not? Well, if it's not infinite, then there must be an edge of it. It must be sitting in something. So
right.
If space is finite, then there must be an infinite thing in which it is sitting, the void or whatever.
Right.
And so that you have to have an infinite substance. And because he defines substance as you can talk about it in itself, you can talk about it without referring to anything outside it that causes it or contains it, then there can only be one thing that is that, which is the infinite substance, which is God.
Yeah. And part of that depends, right, on that no two substances can share an attribute. That's an important step, right? So that if God is infinite and he has all the attributes and no two substances can share an attribute, then everything collapses into God. So I sort of imagine this part of the ethics. I always think of sort of something collapsing into a singularity or a black hole or something like that. He's following the implications of the concept of substance through, and what you get is this singularity in a way.
I think I read somewhere that the substance is basically your metaphysical simple. And I think, just like Wes just said, that if you get down to irreducible metaphysical simples, you have to have some way to explain how they have attributes or properties and how they interact and how they generate each other or don't generate each other. And that's part of the torturous task that you see many philosophers prior to Spinoza going through, trying to explain with generating versus non-generating or perfection, that these things generate things, but they have less perfection than the things that generated them and so on. Mm-hmm. And I think Spinoza basically sort of calls them out and says, all those problems go away if you just acknowledge the reality that the concept itself brings, which is that substance becomes one giant, irreducible single. And this is probably what Leibniz argued with him about, or at least one of the reasons why Leibniz had a huge problem with him, obviously, is that Leibniz had a bunch of irreducible metaphysical simples that he tried to figure out. And then he had something that held them all together, not surprisingly, that had 3 letters and started with a G. So I think Spinoza's solution is really rather elegant because it basically solves a lot of the problems that exist. It's the consequences of what he says, of taking this position, that people don't like. Mm-hmm. It's not that it doesn't solve any problems. In fact, it's very simple, clear, and elegant. It's what happens to free will and independence and a loving, caring, vengeful, moral God, and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Right. So that's the big, just sort of jumping to the big theme here that I wanted to pull out today, is if you have this notion of God as the infinite substance that is everything, is the underlying part of everything, then, in fact, I shouldn't even say the underlying part of everything. It's the container of everything. It is everything.
Right. Right.
And, I don't want to say that God is only nature then.
Right.
God is nature. In fact, he says God gives rise to an infinitely many things in infinitely many ways or something like that. So he has way more attributes than just the attributes that we know him by through our experience of the world. So he transcends nature, but he is nature for sure. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. If you have the notion that there's an infinite being, then everything you see has to be that being. It can't be, there's the transcendent good part of all this stuff is God, but then there's the dirty material things that are corruptions of the divine essence, some version of Platonism. Like, that really doesn't make any sense if you actually believe in God as an infinite being.
Yeah, and I think another way of saying that is that ordinary things that we see in day-to-day life that were classified as substances, right? Each of us, prior to Spinoza, would be a substance. He wants to naturalize that. He wants to say, actually, those really don't rise to the level of substance. So I think he has good reason. I think to mention Kant again, it's that extraction of the metaphysical from the empirical. You don't want to mix those up because you run into a lot of problems. So the sort of noumenal substance really lies at the edge of the periphery, And what you get with human beings now is phenomena. You get psychology. That's what he'll derive his ethical principles from, rather than the metaphysics per se. The metaphysics is sort of negative. It's sort of delimiting a more naturalistic sphere, with the passions and all of that stuff.
And Spinoza is just before his life overlaps a little with Isaac Newton. And so another intellectual trend that came out of this Karen Armstrong book is that whether it's sort of religious-oriented philosophers, seemingly like Spinoza and Leibniz, or the scientists like Newton, they really had this notion, religion and science were very closely tied together, but in this Enlightenment way, where Newton thought, you can talk about the motions of all the objects by just using Newton's laws, but he still thought something had to push the things to get them going in the first place, right? Somebody had to set up these elegant orbits of the planets around each other. And so God was a completely necessary part of his system, the way he conceived it. And so the same thing is going on here with Spinoza, that you can talk about him from as this sort of religious mystical figure. Ooh, everything is God. I'm God. There's God here, God there. But you can also see him as an Enlightenment, somebody who's trying to make science modern, that we don't have to refer to. Right, the way he broke from Aristotle was that we need to talk about causation in terms of efficient causation, physical causation, and he even thinks this is true in the realm of the mind that we'll talk about, that an idea has its cause another idea, has its cause another idea, etc. But he doesn't want to use the language that Aristotle used of final causation, which is, God set things up so that there is a purpose. Like we talked about in our Aristotle ethics episode, of there being sort of a form of man or a form of any kind of living creature, and that we can, if we fulfill that form, if we fulfill our potential, then we're virtuous. If we fail to do that, then we're not virtuous. Well, no, there's no form of man in general for Spinoza. There's particular chemical, whatever, causes within us that move us from point A to point B, that make us do the things that we do, that make us develop in the way that we do, but shouldn't be referring that to some sort of general form talk of God having purposes. And so just seeing how those two things are connected, that if God is conceived as this infinite thing that is everywhere in all things, then a lot of the attributes that we normally attribute to God, in other words, the way we talk about God having a personality,
right?
Like, I have a relationship with God. Well, that implies that I'm not God. But no, I'm God just as much as everything else around me is God. You can't really have a relationship in the way you might think with God. God can't be omniscient. He actually says in this earlier essay, he talked about this specifically, the short treatise on God, man, and his well-being. He says God can't be omniscient because that implies God knows things, right? That implies a difference between the knower and the known, right? That's just what knowledge is. And if we're going to put that metaphor onto God, even talking about God having an intellect, we can't mean the same thing by God's intellect that we do about our intellect. Like, it's just a fundamentally different thing. We can't understand how God could have an intellect or a personality or anything like that. So therefore, God can't have purposes for us that we can fulfill or not fulfill, etc. It really takes the guts out of, even though he's proved, God exists, but it's not the God that you thought. It's not the God that his Jewish and Christian friends thought of.
Yeah, he's very harsh about, those who anthropomorphize God, right? And this is one of the things I think that got him in trouble, because you wonder, you can see why he was accused of atheism, right? If you're saying all there is nature, you can call that God. I mean, I know he's saying a little more than that, but, I think it's a problem once you get rid of the personal God, it becomes a problem for religion, even though at the end of this, he does talk about some sort of religious, I think, it's a difficult part to say what we're left with of God and Spinoza,
Right, because we're all God. Any relationship we have with God has to be some sort of attitude towards ourselves, or
we're all modes,
emphasizing
right?
we're all modes of God. Yes.
God, yeah. So it's not like each of us is. I think the mode thing is important, right? And so that's just, you have the attributes or the essences which are infinite in God, right? The only ones that we are aware of are mind and extension, but they're an infinite number that we don't know about. And then we are modes. Human beings are modes of both extension and mind. So the mode part is sort of a particular thing which I guess partakes of being extended and thinking and stuff like that.
Right. So that's the metaphysical structure.